Yeah.
Good. Okay. Thank you everyone for coming. Thanks for the introduction. I won't, repeat myself too much, but yeah, grew up in Western Kansas, went to K-State, studied biology and philosophy there, did some research in vaccine ethics, particularly in physician attitudes towards parental refusals of the MMRV vaccine. And then I actually did do a year of a master's in bioethics at a different institution before I got into KCU. And most of my research there was in conscientious objection in healthcare. And then as I've been at KCU and a student here, I've mostly been interested in osteopathic philosophy and how I think could take a unique healthcare ethics approach, which is what I'll be presenting on today. This is mainly based off of a paper I wrote, which I'm happy to share with anyone if they would like to read it. But this kind of gives the general idea of it. So just to start with a quote from John McMurray, he's a Scottish personalist. All meaningful knowledge is for the sake of action, and all meaningful action for the sake of friendship. To give an outline of kind of where we're going, I'll give a brief introduction to osteopathic philosophy for anyone who's not familiar with it, and then an introduction to personalist philosophy, and then I'll kind of focus on this idea of corporeality, which I kind of think is the crux between the two. And we'll talk a little bit about the principle of community, and then we'll finish. I'll kind of go through ethical principlism, which is really the main way that American bioethics is approached and certainly taught in medical education. And then I'll kind of finish with how I think an osteopathic approach would be a little bit more unique than that. So, Andrew Taylor Still, the founder of osteopathic medicine, he really kind of had this idea that the human person is complete in this unity of mind, body, and spirit. And I think kind of one of the understated, things with osteopathic medicine that we don't take for granted is that it has a clearly articulated philosophy. And we kind of see it in these four tenets, right? The body is a unit. The body possesses self-regulatory mechanisms. Structure and function are reciprocally interrelated, and rational therapy is based upon an understanding of body unity, self-regulatory mechanisms, and the interrelationship of structure and function. But as far as I know, osteopathic medicine is really the only branch of healthcare in the United States, be that nursing or allopathic medicine, chiropractic care, whatever, that is kind of willing to go out here and say, we actually have an understanding of what a human person is, and we're going to say what they are, we're going to define them, and that's going to determine how we practice, and it's going to determine how we deliver healthcare. And that's actually a pretty bold statement, I think, to make. But I also think it's very helpful because, it says we know something about what we're doing. And in this philosophy, we kind of see that a person is ordered, they're harmonized, they're unified. They're kind of this holistic entity rather than this collection of parts. But they're also more than just a body. So there's different things that factor into who they are as a person. They have inherited factors, they have genetic traits, they have personal experiences, they have a life history and an environment that they exist in. And this all significantly influences who they are and their health and well-being. And this has kind of been, started with Andrew Taylor Still, but has certainly been adopted and adapted. Irving Core, who's often called like the second great osteopathic philosopher, wrote a lot about this kind of in the first edition of the AOA's, osteopathic medicine book. I think it's in later editions as well, maybe not in complete form, but it's a really good read if anyone ever, wants to read more into specific osteopathic philosophy. And here's some kind of quotes pulled out from his writings on that. But that, this idea that physicians minister not to bodies, but to individuals. And these individuals are made up of their mind, their body, their spirit, their personal history, the environment in which they have been in and where they've been living, and their genetic endowment. Now kind of pivoting to personalist philosophy, kind of the first person to key the term, Borden Parker Bown, who I wouldn't say is the most influential personalist, but he is the first person to use the term. It's a newer philosophy. It started kind of in Europe in the early 1900s, kind of as a response to this, what I would say is kind of a radical individualistic thought. It's not a super I would say like main philosophy. It's not like, deontology or consequentialism, but certainly growing. And I think it has a lot of similarities to osteopathic thought.
Looking at the presentation. Thank you, thank you. I need to see everything you needed.
So kind of three authors that I kind of took, inspiration from their writing in this, obviously Borden Parker Bown, John McMurray, who's a Scottish personalist, and then Walter G. Jeffco, who's an American personalist, very formed by McMurray's thoughts. He kind of updates them to contemporary ethical principles and ideas. And so what is personalism? Well, it's a very humanistic philosophy, and it's going to defend human dignity at its core. And it's going to advocate for individual and social transformation, and it's going to talk about communal obligations. And I think this picture is kind of a good example of what it is, because on one end of the spectrum, you have this idea of individualism, right? All that matters is the individual and their individual rights. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you have this idea of collectivism. All that matters is, what's good for the community. The individual doesn't matter. And personalism is going to say, no, what matters is that, we do have individual human dignity, but we experience our humanness and our individuality in and through others. And that's really important. And you can't really make an ethical choice simply based off of individualistic ideas, because you don't exist as an individual. Your individuality exists in the context of others and the community that you're a part of. It's going to go beyond this classical understanding of the human person. And what I mean by that is this classical understanding, it's very dualistic. It's very much so, you are your body and you are your spirit. That's kind of what the ancient Greeks and Romans thought, even early Christianity taught. Personalism, and I would argue even osteopathy, says, well, there's more to being human than just being your body and your spirit. There's also this aspect of your mind. There's this idea that, we have, sorry, I lost my train of thought there. There's this idea that we have these like personal categories, and there's nuance to being human that doesn't fit exactly into this mind or into just the body and the spiritual categories. And so it's going to incorporate, both deontological and consequentialist concepts. It's going to say, okay, well, there's an inherent dignity to the individual, and that's very duty-based. But it's also going to say that there's ethical choices that we make, they should promote the individual well-beings and the communities, and that's very consequentialist in mind. And so now kind of what I would say, I think the crux is between the two ideas, both osteopathy and personalism, is this idea of corporeality, that human dignity comes from our embodiment, and that we, experience ourselves and one another as living bodies, not disembodied wills, that we live and we negotiate with the world by and in and through our bodies. And they're necessarily subject to things like vulnerability, dependability, and finitude. And you see that all the time in healthcare, right? You encounter individuals when they're vulnerable, when they're dependable, and in their finitude. From the moment you're born, you're dependent on others. And when you're dying, you're dependent on others. And in various stages in your life, you are dependent on others. And it's going to say that, these human goods that we can name, they're based in our embodiment, they come out of it. And we could kind of break them down into 4 categories. Kind of at the lowest level, we would have like our biological goods. So food, water, whatever it might be. And then above that, our psychological goods, our mental well-being, emotional stability. And then social goods, family, friends, community. And then finally, on top of that, creative goods, or you could call them spiritual goods. These would be things like education, knowledge, learning a new skill, or if you're religious or spiritual, finding unity with God or some spiritual being. And it's going to say that, the body specifically is integral to a person's identity and being and to these human goods. And I think that's really where personalism and osteopathy kind of align very well. Another thing I think kind of unique to personalism is this what I would say is the principle of community. This idea that, individuals are inherently relational and rational agents, and we experience our personal well-being through relationships. And self-realization is not achieved, simply in isolation, but through an active participation in communal relationships with others. So that quote at the beginning, like, we do all these things for friendship, and we appreciate freedom and justice in the context of community and in friendship. And it's still going to acknowledge that each person has a unique history and a cultural context in which they exist. But again, that we can't really evaluate our moral choices separate from our relationships with others, how they affect others, and how others' decisions affect us. Now moving on to ethical principlism. So this is really the classic approach to American healthcare ethics. If you are a physician, this is probably what you were taught or what you are instructed on commonly. It's found in this text, Principles of Biomedical Ethics by Beecham and Childress. They kind of focus on these four principles: autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence, and justice. So, autonomy, respecting individuals' rights to self-determination; beneficence, we want to do good, do the right thing; non-maleficence, we want to, do no harm; and then, justice, we want to focus on fairness and equality. And they kind of give a framework and a guide to ethical decision making. And it's certainly connected to the deontology of Kant, but it's not entirely based in his teachings. And I don't think there's anything wrong with these four principles at all, but I think, what we'll see is there are some criticisms of how they approach it. And particularly, I think personalism in general is going to be critical of any ethical theory that's going to kind of prioritize these abstract rules or principles without considering that there's an individual and relational context in which moral decisions are made. So, personalism is going to say a good ethical theory needs to be responsive to the needs and the well-being of individuals in specific situations. It needs to account for certain moral duties to individuals, and it needs to acknowledge the consequences of actions on the individual and the broader community. And so one particular author, Shea, he criticizes Beecham and Childress because he says, they kind of lack this explicit theory of the good. Basically, what they give us is this procedural set of beliefs and kind of a consistent set of behaviors, but they're unable to identify certain criteria, or what is the good, or how do we make those judgments outside of these established concepts. And so simply consistently following certain principles doesn't necessarily mean that we're always ensuring ethical correctness. They don't really give a moral foundation or a theory for these. And so then it can be hard to resolve conflicts between principles, like when autonomy and beneficence are conflicting. If you can't address the philosophical foundations of, what the good is and why it matters, then you don't know why you should prioritize certain principles over others. So when autonomy conflicts with beneficence or justice, the resolution in kind of their categorical thinking totally depends on subjective judgment. And that can be, very inconsistent in application depending on the culture or the context that you're in. And that's certainly not, I could probably give an entire presentation criticizing Beecham and Childress, but that's kind of the main thing. I don't think anyone's certainly upset with these principles. They're all good things, but when you don't have a value theory backing them up, it can become unclear about how to solve conflicts. In contrast, I think that personalism, has an explicit theory of the good. And I would say it's kind of based in these five ideals. The dignity of human persons. Every person has intrinsic worth and is an end in themselves. Relational fulfillment. Fulfillment and the good are achieved in community and individual relationships. And from that comes freedom and responsibility. Ethical freedom should be directed towards realizing the good for oneself and for others. It's going to integrate these material and spiritual dimensions, both in our physical well-being and our spiritual and mindful growth. And then this idea of the common good, that, individual flourishing contributes to and is enriched by the goodness and the welfare of the community. So to finish up, because all of this doesn't mean nothing if we don't have anywhere to move forward, I think that much like, we would say osteopathic medicine offers a unique vision to the public of how we're going to treat our patients and how we're going to approach healthcare. I think we would have a unique view of healthcare ethics. And with this in mind, this is kind of what I'm proposing. Is that, we would treat the whole patient with the principle of unity, the first tenet of osteopathic medicine, and we would apply it to that patient's life context. So we're going to recognize that we experience our existence as embodied persons in a community, not in isolation. It's going to be individually holistic and communally holistic. And the way I think about it is like, you can't really evaluate the heart without evaluating the lungs and all the other things that are connected to it. And you can't really evaluate a person without evaluating all the other persons that they're connected with. And so kind of two key questions, I think, that, we should be asking ourselves when we're encountering these moral dilemmas or these ethical dilemmas in healthcare. The first and foremost is, how does this action contribute to the fulfillment and the growth of this individual person? And then the follow-up being, how do the circumstances of this action and the proportionality of its consequences fit within the context of the community to which this person belongs? And I really think this approach is going to honor individuals as unique, and it's going to honor their history and their cultural context. It's going to recognize, human intelligence and freedom and respect for self-determination. And those aren't necessarily unique to personalism. But I think really where it kind of gets its uniqueness is its emphasis on our embeddedness in communities. These communities full of people with diverse temperaments and experiences and value systems, and how we're going to balance both obligations to the individual and obligations to the community, and the community's obligations to the individual. And finally, and I think where it's most helpful is, it's going to treat these laws and these principles like beneficence, autonomy, justice as guides, not constraints to achieving our human fulfillment. And so in that way, it makes ethical thinking more of a map and a guide rather than these constraints we have to follow all the time, because it recognizes that, human behavior is always evolving. Our understanding of human nature is evolving. Our understanding of humanness is evolving. And so we can adapt as that changes. So that is everything I have. I'd like to, acknowledge Dr. Luke Bobo, Dr. Aaron Siegel, and Dean Katowski. They've read through my paper, gave comments, gave me things to read, so very helpful to them. And those are my references, and I'm certainly happy to answer any questions anyone might have.